Hey, we hope you're having a great day. I'm Tom.
I'm Holly.
And welcome to HBC's YouTube channel. Hello and welcome back to Journey Through the Bible. We're so excited to be sharing with you again today, and we hope you're enjoying the series. Holly, how are you finding the series?
I'm really loving it. I'm really loving getting into the habit of reading the Bible every day and of going off and researching around the subject and just understanding a bit better what it meant then, but also applying it to today. So we hope you're really making the most of this series and enjoying it as much as we are enjoying putting it together. So today we'll be concluding Romans chapter 1, and it's a bit of a challenging read, but it's a really good one, so it'll be really thought-provoking and we hope you enjoy it. Romans 1, 18 to 32. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women, and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men, and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. So, not an easy read, but nevertheless it's good to engage with all of God's word and not pick and choose. So I'm looking at verses 18 to 20. The first thing we're hit with is that idea of God's wrath. Now, it's not a comfortable thing to think about. We don't talk about it much. It's not an easy subject, but nevertheless, it's a part of God's character, and we have to identify with that. But when we understand God's wrath, it needs to be understood in a different way. So it's not as if we experience human anger. So when I get angry, I might, lose my temper, lose my rag, shout, get cross, stomp up the stairs, that kind of thing. This wrath that's described is not like us humans. So often when we get angry, it's about frustration, and often it's not righteous anger, it's just irritation, an explosion of uncontrolled emotion. But for God, wrath is not seen as like God throwing his toys out of the pram, but it's based on that axes that he's got, that this standard is absolutely immovable, that God's way of doing things, that God's stance on sin is not going to change. And so it's like he holds that in balance on this axis when he talks about this wrath. And so God is able to do what we can't do as humans because he is God, and that's how we have to see it, that he's a divine being, so different from us. But he is able to infinitely love the sinner without restriction, without condition. He absolutely loves the sinner, but he cannot tolerate the sin. And so in that way we see that God's wrath is more of a channel and a direct thing, not directed at a person, but directed at the act of sin. And that God absolutely detests and despises that sin. and he can't get past that. So for him, it's less of a burst of anger, but more of a maintained moral standard that's directed at sin. Paul also states that God's divinity has been shown in our world, that when we look at our creation, how can we not see that there's a creator involved? He's saying basically that as humans we can't deny that. We know that there must be a presence of God because of our creation. And he harks at that in his own culture, but let's be honest, we can still say the same thing today. How often does that argument come up that life is just too perfect to be a mistake, and so it points to a creator? And so what Paul's saying is that part of God's wrath is coming from the fact that we as humans can identify that there must be something more, that there must be a creator, but rather than engage with that and rather than accept that and believe that for what it is, we choose to look the other way, because if we look the other way, we're able to carry on with our sin without having to change, without confrontation, and we can live our lives as we choose. So it's kind of that idea that God's wrath is directed at the sin, but also the attitude that we sometimes fall into of like we're enough, and our world and our way of doing things is self-contained and there's no need for a God or a ruler. Whereas actually Paul is saying, look, it's evident that there's a creator, and to acknowledge that is the right thing to do, and to disregard it is as if looking at a valuable treasure and completely discarding it for something that's completely meaningless.
Let's move on, verses 21 to 25. Now in these verses, Paul tackles the subject of idol worship. In Greco-Roman times, idol worship was commonplace, much like it is in our modern day today. Though in our modern day today, maybe it's not so much bronze statues and stone statues, but there's definitely idol worship in things like celebrities, sports teams, wealth, your jobs, in relationships even, and so on. But we find as we read on that God lets them. God doesn't stand in their way. He gives them the free will that they've always had. And chaos erupts. I mean, in one hand, you've got God, and in the other hand, you have these mere mortal imitations. And they don't just add up. And Paul says that. Paul says, why are you giving up something that is so worthy, so precious, so amazing for that? I mean, come on.
So verses 26 and 27, not an easy read, but let's engage with it anyway. Now this is cited as a key passage in this argument of how God views homosexuality. And when we read it, it's hard to get away from the fact that it shows that God takes no delight in homosexual relations. Yeah, Paul uses this phrase, they exchanged the natural for what was unnatural. And so it's as if that we're looking at this standard again. And although it's really tempting in our society and our modern culture to say, okay, well, in our modern society, that homosexual relationships are completely commonplace and normal, so that must be a natural thing now. We have to look at this from when it was written, the context it was written, but also for what it's getting at. And what it's getting at here is God's standard and God's interpretation of what's natural and unnatural. And so when we look at that, we need to look back at Genesis and see what does God present as the natural relation. So he says at the start, it's not good for man to be alone. And so he gives woman. And so for us as Christians, that tells us that God intended relationships to be for a man and for a woman. And so when we look at this, we need to look at it with God's perspective of it. So that natural and unnatural thing is of God's standard, not what our society says. And so although that can feel like a really tough read, I think it's really important that we engage with what the author was intending. And so I would suggest that in this passage and in this argument as a whole, that God is still holding that firm stance that relationships are for a man and for a woman, and that actually that is the best plan for humanity, and that is what God intended.
Verses 28 to 32. Paul goes on to list a number of vices and sins that really show that the moral standards of the day are slipping. And it made me think, in our culture today, haven't we let our moral standards slip away from us as well? Paul concludes that by living a life of defiance, we are sentencing ourselves to death. Now, this isn't a divine execution, but it's a result of being separated from God by our own choices. By choosing to go our own way, we cannot get away from the fact that sin ultimately separates us from God.
And so the application for us today is this. Just as Tom was saying, in Paul's time we saw that society had traded the value of God and his life for them for something meaningless and temporary. Like we see the same in our own society. It's so easy to pursue our own ideals and our own views of our life rather than upholding God's plan for us. And I was just reminded about this quote by C.S. Lewis. He says this: "Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important." And so both in Paul's time and now, the question looms for us. As humanity, that question is presented to us again. Do we want to do life God's way or our way? And so today, we pose that same question to you. Are you going to live your life with God in it or without it?
So that brings the video to an end. Thank you for tuning in, and please do share in the comments and the emails and the social medias. You know how it goes by now. So yeah, do get in touch and also share with each other. Why not phone up someone else and see if they're watching as well, and encourage them as well. So yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. Take care.